Bom, gente, seguindo aqui nossas palestras, eu tenho a honra de chamar ao palco o Jonathan Dawnson. Quem aqui já ouviu falar ou conhece a Schumacher College? Esse público está muito bom. Então, para quem não conhece, a Schumacher é uma das principais escolas mundiais, né, sobre essa nova economia e essa nova forma de pensar negócios. E o Jonathan é um principais curadores e colaboradores da escola, que é lá de Londres, e ele hoje é o coordenador do programa de pós-graduação de economia para transição, ou seja, muito isso que a gente veio falando ao longo da manhã. Hoje, ele vem trazer aqui para vocês a visão dele sobre o quanto a gente tem que pensar, enquanto corporação, não o crescimento está no centro, né? Se a gente quer viver uma nova economia onde as pessoas e a sustentabilidade e o olhar para o todo, que é o grande assunto do Colabora América, as organizações precisam ter um outro olhar de crescimento. Então, ele vem fazer esse talk que, para mim, de certa forma, é algo muito disruptivo dentro do cenário corporativo atual, né? As pessoas muito olham para o crescimento, só que a custo de quê? Né? A custo do mundo e do que a gente está vivendo hoje. Então, o Jonathan vem trazer essa nova visão para a gente. Hello, Jonathan. Thanks for coming. Welcome. A palestra também vai ser em inglês, então quem precisar de tradutor, a gente tem os tradutores simultâneos ali, tá bom?
So thank you for coming. It was good to see so many hands go up in recognition at the name Schumacher College. I just want to check that the translation is working. Indicate it's working. So I don't know about you, but for me personally, I find that if I've been sitting still for half an hour and someone has been speaking to me, there isn't much space to hear anything new. You recognize that? So I'm gonna suggest that we take 5 minutes to either take a pee break, stand up, stretch, turn to your neighbor who you've never met before and just explain, or how are you doing, how are you today, make contact with someone you haven't seen before. Let's take 5 minutes to create some space for some new stories to enter. Put away your mobile phones, find a human being. Thank you. It's always a real joy for me to come to Brazil. I used to come quite frequently. It's my first time in 8 years, and I just find your country such a joy to visit. So a big thank you to Thomas and the team for making it possible. Does anyone else other than me love stories? So really at the heart of my talk this morning is the importance of stories, the importance of language, stories. It seems to me that we are surrounded by stories encoded in visual messages. This tells a story. We're surrounded by stories that we're frequently unaware of. They're so deeply wedded into the culture that we're part of. They're the invisible ideological frameworking of our civilization's belief systems that very often we don't really even notice them. And I want to make the case that this is particularly true in the field of economics, and particularly around the imagery and the narratives surrounding economic growth. And that we're at a moment, I've just spotted someone I haven't seen in 10 years. Hello. An Irish colleague. Lovely to see you again, Simon. So there's another story here. This is the Chinese ideogram for crisis, which comprises two different elements. One is danger and the other is opportunity. It's a really beautiful, juicy juxtaposition of concepts. And I think that not least in where you're at the moment in Brazil, that this is a useful metaphor to draw upon. But I think it's not just in Brazil, that this is a global phenomenon, particularly to do with the impact of our runaway growth-driven economic system. And I'm going to suggest that we're really struggling to change this. We're struggling to change the economic system in part because of the vested interests that lie behind perpetuating business as usual, but also because our ways of understanding the world are so conditioned by narratives and metaphors and narratives that are deeply embedding, deeply reinforcing the growth paradigm. And I'm going to be suggesting that this is a time, the times of transition as at the moment are times when we need to become much more conscious, much more explicit about what the dominant narratives are, and to really skillfully begin to find ways of transforming the narrative. Does that make sense so far? I see some nodding heads. Good. So this is something that we tend to do at Schumacher College, is to look beyond the immediate manifestations to what are the deep belief systems underpinning our current ways of being. So looking way upstream at that belief systems that are often narratives and belief systems that are often so embedded we don't even notice they're there. And this is the invitation to step back and begin to consciously examine what some of these belief systems are. So just a little bit of so the focus from now on is looking at economic growth, where we are at the moment, how we got here, and how we can begin to unhook ourselves from addiction to growth, both in terms of policy and in terms of our belief systems and narratives. So this is what growth is a really astonishingly recent phenomenon. There's this wonderful quote from a guy called Eric Beinhocker. I'm just going to read this out so the translators can have it. To summarize 2.5 million years of economic history in brief, for a very, very, very long time, not much happened. Then suddenly all hell broke loose. It took 99.4% of economic history to reach the wealth levels of the Yanomamo, 0.59% to double that to that level by 1750, and then just 0.01% for global wealth to leap to the levels of the modern world. To summarize 2.5, Another way to think of this is that over 97% of humanity's wealth was created in just the last 0.1% of our history. As the economist David Landis describes it, the Englishman of 1750 was closer in material terms to Caesar's legionnaires than to his own great-grandchildren. Extraordinary. Totally extraordinary. This explosion, all hell broke loose, and suddenly we have a system that we've kind of, I think we assume, is some sort of God-given natural development that year on year the economy grows, and we've got this thing called progress. Very recent phenomenon. So there's two different interpretations, there's two stories. How did this happen? How did we move from being, in economic terms, having a largely steady state economy for 99.7% of humanity to suddenly all hell breaking loose? And I'm going to suggest that there are two key alternative stories to explain this, and to become conscious of these stories is critical in terms of enabling us to make a choice to leave the growth path. So the first story says that in medieval Europe, before the advent of the scientific revolution, really the idea of progress, year-on-year progress, economic growth, it simply wasn't there. And people's cosmology, their stories were much more cyclical in nature. They followed the cycle of the season. They followed what anthropologists call the myth of the eternal return, this idea that a people will sing or dance the world back into existence every year at the turning of the year. So the concept of time was much more cyclical. And certainly the idea of year-on-year progress would not have been there. It wasn't there. Then, through the brilliance of human ingenuity, the scientific revolution comes along, we begin to have thinkers, the metaphors begin to shift towards the earth as a machine that we can manipulate for the satisfaction of human needs. This in turn leads to the Industrial Revolution, the birth of modern economics. Towards the beginning of the 20th century, two wars wipe out much of the physical assets in one part of the world. This is called a world war. It's not a world war, it's a European war. The Europeans wrote history. But that then following the reconstruction of the world war, we began to develop GDP, gross domestic product, as the key indicator, the key measure of societal progress. And then we move into the Cold War, competition between capitalism and communism on the basis of which grows faster, and the whole development mythology. So that's one story, and I'm guessing that you're going to recognize this story as a true story. It's like what happened, no? It's a story that we get in our history class. Very much reinforced by the theoretical, the ideological position. So this is a famous development economist called Rostow, who described, and this is thinking that pervades our policy making to this day. I spent a decade working in Africa watching Rostow's ideas steamrolling communities and cultures in Africa, and exactly the same in Latin America. So Rostow's idea is that there is one journey, there's one unilinear journey from rural, indigenous, primitive, feminine to urban, industrial, mass consumerist, patriarchal, and that's the direction of travel that has been imposed through structural adjustment in Brazil, throughout Latin America, throughout Africa, and much of Asia. So this is the dominant story. I want some body language. Do you recognize this story? Great. So I'm going to suggest that there's a totally other way of explaining the phenomenon, and that is the energy-based story. So even from early days of this century, there have been critics of this story. One, the economist Kenneth Boulding, famously said, to believe you can have exponential growth in a finite system, you need to be either mad or an economist. And again, tellingly, the guy who created GDP as the principal measure of economic wealth said, whatever else you do, do not use this as a measure of societal well-being. So there were critical voices from within the system, but fundamentally this is the dominant societal narrative, which I suggest to you is so deeply encoded within all of us who've been through the school system as to be the truth. So here comes an alternative interpretation. Sorry, I'm having to swivel to just a couple more slides here before I move on to the second story. The story is so deeply embedded that politicians of left and right, including your own beloved Marina, embrace growth as part of their political platform. I read her platform, and unquestioningly it accepts that growth is a necessity. That's not a necessity, it's somehow a God-given rule that the economy must grow. So the adjectives change. Sustained growth, sustainable growth, green, greener, smart, good. These are all adjectives as fashions come and go that are added to the growth term, but the noun remains oppressively consistent, unquestioned. I think now finally we do have the second story. So the second story would suggest that the growth in GDP, growth in economic activity, very closely mirrors growths in the availability of fossil fuels, or generally of energy. And so in one graph, my proposal is that while the scientific revolution and the industrial revolution were clearly factors, they weren't the driving causes. They were contingent on massive injection of energy, initially from the conquest of the Americas. So remembering that at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, 70% of all energy came in the form of human muscle. So human muscle in this period, up until the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, was the critical energy source. And effectively, Europe captured the energy availability in the Americas together with the precious metals and all the agricultural products that slavery enabled. And that it was this injection that enabled the development of a society in which we had castes of thinkers and inventors and technologists who were then able to develop the technologies that enabled us to access fossil fuels, this once in a planet's lifetime bequest of energy, never repeatable. So that fundamentally looking at core causes, the second story suggests that the advances in human intelligence and technological capacity were contingent, were dependent upon a once in a planet's lifetime injection of energy, initially in the form of slaves, and then in the form of fossil fuels, that has enabled this to happen. So far, so good? Good. So the point is that you could say, okay, so these are two interesting stories, and maybe it's purely abstract and academic which one we choose. But I'm going to make the case that actually the choice that we make in terms of which story feels more true has critical consequences in terms of the future of our civilization, of our global civilization. Because if we go for the first one, I'm just going to read a quote. Please forgive me for bringing Ronald Reagan into the room. Ronald Reagan, there is no such thing as limits to growth, because there are no limits on the human capacity for intelligence, imagination, and wonder. So that is the logical consequence of story number one. And this is not fanciful. This is the story that underlies like all the governments of the world, with the possible exception of Bhutan and North Korea, have economic growth as the core function of public policy. So Reagan has done us a favor of exposing the truth by stating it very bluntly, but fundamentally this belief that we respond to ecological and social crisis by further technological innovation, further putting our foot on the accelerator, putting the accelerator to the floor to further advance the speed of technological innovation is the logical consequence of story number one, and it's the story that we're seeing acted out by governments around the world. So even a document as noble as the Sustainable Development Goals, strategy, further economic growth. So I would suggest entirely self-defeating. Good. So what I've done is beginning to unpick the dominant societal narrative. Let's look a little bit deeper at the growth phenomenon. And yep, Catherine, did you cover this a little bit? You did it a little bit. Okay, so a team of scientists working at the Stockholm Resilience Institute in Stockholm, unsurprisingly. Closer. Okay, thank you. Good. So a team of scientists working at the Stockholm Resilience Institute looked at 9 planetary boundaries, saying it's not just climate change. There are 9 different, so it's acidification of the ocean, it is loss of biodiversity, a total of 9 planetary boundaries that we must stay within. And that currently in at least 3 of these we're exceeding the boundary. So really risking significant damage to ecosystem species as we're seeing playing out, being driven by the continual incessant exponential growth of our economies. Those eco-socialists at HSBC Bank, finding that their research tells them that we are consuming the sustainable yield of natural resource that we're consuming it every year by August the 1st. So I think, again, to use a metaphor here, that until August the 1st, think of an apple tree. Until August the 1st, we're simply picking the apples. After August the 1st, we're eating into the wood of the tree, limiting its future capacity to deliver apples, to deliver a harvest. 3 studies, I'm not going to go into these in detail, but 3 recent studies from different countries in Europe suggesting that even under scenarios of extraordinarily generous carbon price at 10 times the price, the rate it is at the moment, given the assumption of highly favorable technological development, highly favorable government policy, that as long as growth remains, economic growth remains within the equation, we cannot come back within planetary boundaries. So all the technological innovation and clever politicking in the world in terms of carbon pricing makes no difference, is outweighed by the weight of extra resource exploitation that is driven by economic growth. I just picked up three headlines that I just screen grabbed from the last week. I could have picked many others. These are just 3 that I've picked in the last week from The Guardian, all pointing to ecological overshoot. Okay, so just a couple more points before where I want to end this talk is asking the question, I hope where we're going to get to is we're going to get to a place of saying it is clear that economic growth is no longer either possible or desirable, and we need to find other ways of self-organizing as societies. And asking the question, are there any nice alternative metaphors that are sticky? And by sticky, sorry for the translators, by sticky I mean stories that really land and people can look at them and go, yes, this makes much more sense. And I'm going to suggest that there are 3 current alternative narratives that tell a totally different story and that I think are so cleverly put together in terms of their design that people can look at them and go, even the broad public can look at them and go, this makes sense. So that's where I'm going to finish. But just before, on the route to that destination, I just want to do a little bit of further undermining of both the possibility and the desirability of economic growth. So the first point I made was that, and these slides were demonstrating that we are in ecological overshoot, and the evidence suggests that it doesn't matter how clever we are with our technology, and our policy making that as long as we have growth, we are compelled to further undermine the web of life. So a second critique is, what does actually GDP include? Gross domestic product, the principal measure of economic activity. So there are many things that GDP includes that are not conducive to planetary and human well-being. Oil spills, wars, pesticides, arms sales, these are all great for our GDP, but they're clearly not conducive to well-being. Similarly, there's tons of stuff that is essential to human flourishing and ecological flourishing that are not included in GDP. So these include parenting, volunteering, community work, the social capital that holds our societies together. So what would happen if you factored these various elements in, if you subtracted the bads that are currently included and you added the goods that are currently not included, how would the numbers stack up? So this is one of the measures, one of the alternatives to GDP that has developed in recent years, called the Genuine Progress Indicator. And this, again, apologies to the translators, I don't even know if you're trying to cover this, but these are the things that the Human Development Index, otherwise known as Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare, it's the same thing. These are the things that they include that GDP excludes. So these are subtracting the bads and adding in the goods that are not currently counted. When you crunch the numbers, in country after country and globally, you see that while GDP continues to increase, well-being, welfare flatlines or drops. So this is what Herman Daly has called uneconomic growth. There is growth, but the costs of growth exceed the benefits. A further really interesting phenomenon, what economists call the Easterlin paradox, is that while it looks like there is a significant statistical relationship between increased well-being and increases for GDP for very poor people, that actually beyond a number that's generally estimated to be between $10,000 and $15,000 per capita, the relationship breaks. So, or rather it flatlines. So subjective feelings of well-being, life expectancy, access to health and education improve dramatically for poor people when you increase their per capita incomes. But beyond about $10,000 to $14,000, in other words, much lower than the current level of consumption and economic activity of the global consumer class, the link breaks. There's no longer a significant statistical relationship between further economic growth and further increases in well-being. One final point I want to look to is the impact of economic growth on inequality. And I'm not going to bore you with the data. It's been in this broad recognition that economic growth further increases the gap between the rich and the poor. Oxfam's latest estimate is that 8 men own assets to the value of the poorest 50% of humanity. This gap has been driven dramatically in recent years. So, this matters. Inequality matters. One study I want to refer to is done by a couple of English medical researchers who were tracking the correlation between levels of inequality in society and various social indicators, which you will see listed on the left, and finding, so the countries on the left are countries that are relatively equal. The countries on the right are those that have large gaps between the rich and the poor. This is only the OECD countries, demonstrating that in country after country, or rather in terms of homicide rates, in terms of suicides, in terms of drug abuse, child pregnancies, on and on and on, that more equal countries that have less strong growth targets are healthier, happier places. So in summary, in summary, there are 4 1-minute, I'm going to need 5. I'm going to take 5, yeah. So in summary, there are very good reasons for suggesting that not only is the core story of how growth happened not valuable, but that in addition, there are very good reasons for saying that growth is neither desirable nor possible, and that we need to find new stories, or we need to find new images, new metaphors, new narratives that are much more in accord with the truth of the situation, and that people can get, that people can look at and go, this really makes sense. And in the 4 minutes left to me, I'm going to race through 3 of what I think are really clever, like artistically, creatively clever ways of creating sticky images, metaphors, narratives that broad society can look at and go, that makes sense. So the first one is something called the Happy Planet Index. And the Happy Planet Index measures only 3 things. It measures life expectancy, subjective feelings of well-being, and ecological footprint. So the very simple question it's asking is, how much resource do we need to use to live long, happy lives? Very simple question. And the beautiful thing about this is that not one European or North American country appears in the top 50, because their advances in social and in ecological terms or rather their progress in social terms are bought at such a terrible ecological cost that it's creating human happiness but not planetary well-being. So Costa Rica always comes first, and Central American countries tend to do really well. The second measure, this is a really interesting, I think this holds out lots of potential for changing the frame, changing the mindset. So on the vertical axis, we have the Human Development Index. So the countries of the world, color-coded by continent, are mapped on this graph. So on the horizontal axis is the Human Development Index, used by the United Nations. It includes GDP, health, education, and levels of inequality. And on the vertical axis, we have the ecological footprint. How much resource use is the per capita average for the countries in question? So you see that the African countries are living well within their planetary share of ecological resource. So their ecological footprint is really low, but the Human Development Index is really low as well. So they're not living, life expectancy is not so great, and subjective feelings of well-being are often rather low. On the right-hand side of the graph, European, North American, Middle Eastern oil-rich states are reporting very high levels of Human Development Index, but at a terrible ecological cost. So should not the purpose of public policy be to ask the question, how do we get into the, how do we get into the sustainable development quadrant where we're achieving high levels of human development scores with a low ecological footprint? Is that not a more intelligent question to be asking than how do we grow the economy? So the current rationale given for current economic policy, the focus on economic growth, is it's a proxy for improving well-being. So why not stop using the proxy and start really aiming at how do we improve human and planetary well-being? The final, I'm looking nervously towards my minder, the final metaphor, the final narrative that I think that actually holds the greatest potential, I noticed Catherine spoke a little bit to this in her presentation, is Kate Raworth's The Donuts. So you remember this, the planetary boundaries diagram. There are 9 planetary boundaries that we must not exceed without activating tipping points in biophysical systems. So Kate came to this and said, good, but there must also be a social floor below which we do not fall. So she drew in the SDGs to develop measures, to develop targets for access to education, access to health services, to clean water, gender equality, political voice, and so on, and saying that the safe space for humanity, the safe and just space for humanity, is above the social floor but below the planetary boundary. very intelligent framing of the challenge that lies before us. And so the question is, what would meetings look like? Meetings at every level from the federal government right down to schools and households look like if they were asking this question, how do we stay within the safe and just space for humanity? I just want to finish with one quote. This isn't a quote, except I'm quoting myself, but this read so well that I thought I just wanted to read it word for word. We are indeed, as the techno-optimists say, a brilliant and inventive species, but that does not mean there is no such thing as limits. Our great capacity for innovation will not bring back the species lost in recent decades in the relentless pursuit of economic growth. Could we not now use our intelligence, imagination, and wonder in the service of weaving ourselves back into the web of life, of developing technologies that work in harmony with natural systems rather than against them, of designing systems that draw upon the creative genius and capacity for love inherent in our species, of becoming better stewards of our planetary home. And to quote Kate, instead of economies that need to grow whether or not they make us thrive, we need economies that make us thrive whether or not they enable economic growth.
Gente, alguém quer aproveitar, fazer uma pergunta?
Jonathan, thank you. I'd like to ask a little bit about the process of learning all these concepts and ideas that you presented for us today. How do you suggest or how do you practice on your learning practices when you are as a facilitator that we kind of sink down this kind of content? Because it's also fairly easy to say that sometimes we learn in our rational mind, but then do we act accordingly? So just a comment on that, I think, would be very rich. Thank you.
So the question was, how do we become playfully creative with this kind of stuff? And for me, my interests are really at the juncture point of political economy and the arts, particularly theatre. So I noticed that that part of our problem is that the progressive left has tended to believe that if it presents the most logical, carefully worked out arguments, it will win, and it doesn't, because we're much more, like the meaning-making process is much more subject to creativity, visual arts, imagery, and so the great transformations that I have seen have been when people who are working with political economy have got together with artists and dancers and stand-up comedians and theatre people and really asked, how can we present this material in a way that is creatively, playfully attractive? I think you're also asking for a plug for Changing the Frame. So there's a course that my friend did last year at the college called Changing the Frame, the Science and Art of Communication for Transition, which runs again this year in January, so please sign up and come. Or maybe better still is if those in Brazil, and there are 3 people who did this course in the room at the moment, is do that course here, is create a course in Brazil, and it's so much more playful than reading economics textbooks.
One more?
Hi, Jonathan. My question for you is that you're bringing a systemic view of the system, capitalism, and growth. But what can we do in our daily lives to bring about change?
So what can we do in our daily lives to bring about change? Like when that question comes up, the first thing I always say is stop. We need to stop defining ourselves as individuals and find our tribe. and work collaboratively and collectively with others. I mean, beyond that, we've got to do what we love to do, and that's different for everybody.
Thank you so much.